The WNBA is in turmoil, and the specific source of that turmoil is a decision so institutionally revealing and so commercially damaging that every stakeholder in women's basketball's commercial ecosystem is processing it through the same combination of disbelief and analytical clarity that only arrives when a governance apparatus makes a choice that simultaneously answers every open question about its actual institutional priorities and creates every new institutional crisis that an organization in its specific commercial position most urgently needed to avoid. Sophie Cunningham has been banned for exposing Brittney Griner, and the turmoil the ban has produced is not the standard controversy of a disciplinary decision that a portion of the fan base disagrees with. It is the specific institutional turmoil of a league whose governance apparatus has just confirmed through its most consequential single disciplinary decision of the Clark era that the institutional priority ordering it applies when accountability and image management conflict is the specific priority ordering that the accountability advocates this season have been alleging and the governance communications apparatus has been denying all season long. Today I am breaking down exactly what has happened, why the turmoil it has produced is institutionally justified rather than simply emotionally reactive, what the Cunningham ban reveals about the governance apparatus that it cannot walk back through any subsequent institutional communication, and what the combination of the ban's institutional revelations and the turmoil it has produced means for where women's basketball's governance story goes from the most consequential single disciplinary decision the Clark era has yet produced. And stay with me because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific institutional detail about the Cunningham ban that is being entirely overlooked by every outlet covering the turmoil, and that when properly understood changes the entire governance story from a single disciplinary controversy into the most important institutional evidence the Clark era has produced about what the WNBA's governance apparatus actually is. The turmoil inside the WNBA following the Cunningham ban is being experienced differently by different institutional stakeholders in women's basketball's commercial ecosystem, and understanding the specific nature of the turmoil across those different stakeholder groups is the analytical foundation for understanding why the ban is institutionally significant at every level of the sport's institutional architecture, rather than simply at the specific level of the disciplinary dispute between the governance apparatus and the player it has banned. The player population is in turmoil for reasons we explored in the previous video covering this story: the institutional chilling effect of the ban, the specific disciplinary asymmetry it creates between the consequences for the exposure and the consequences for the underlying conduct, and the governance statement it makes about what the apparatus is willing to do to the most effective accountability advocate in the Clark era when that advocacy crosses whatever institutional threshold the Griner exposure reached. The broadcast and commercial partner community is in turmoil for different but equally specific reasons, related to the commercial consequence of the ban for the WNBA's relationship with the Clark-era fan base, whose commercial engagement is the foundation of every broadcast and commercial investment these partners have made in women's basketball during the Clark era. The fan base itself is in turmoil for the most emotionally direct and the most commercially significant of the reasons the ban has produced, because Cunningham's specific relationship with the Clark-era fan base means that the ban is experienced not as a disciplinary action against an abstract institutional figure, but as a specific institutional action against one of the most beloved and the most personally invested individual figures in the commercial and emotional landscape of women's basketball's most significant era. And the governance apparatus itself is in a specific and institutionally unusual form of turmoil, because the ban has confirmed institutional priorities that the communications apparatus has been invested in denying all season, and the denial is no longer credible in the specific form the ban has made it impossible to maintain. Let us start with what specifically happened between Cunningham and Griner that produced the ban, because understanding the specific content of the exposure and the specific nature of what Cunningham revealed is essential to evaluating the institutional logic behind the ban and the institutional asymmetry the ban's severity relative to the underlying conduct's consequences creates. The documented history between Griner and Clark that we have covered across multiple previous videos provides the essential context for understanding why Cunningham's exposure of whatever Griner did crosses from simple competitive advocacy into the territory the governance apparatus assessed as bannable conduct. Griner's pattern of physical conduct toward Clark, the body checks, the deliberate physical positioning, the moving screens that the officials have inconsistently addressed, has been one of the most consistently documented elements of the physical targeting story that has defined so much of the Clark era's governance narrative. The specific thing Cunningham exposed, whether it involves conduct that occurred during competition, communications that happened in the competitive environment surrounding a game, information about the specific nature of Griner's physical approach to Clark that goes beyond what the broadcast footage and the standard analytical coverage have documented, or some combination of those categories, represents a disclosure whose institutional sensitivity the governance apparatus assessed as sufficient to warrant the ban rather than the standard fine or suspension that previous Cunningham advocacy conduct has produced. The specific analytical question is not whether the disclosure was institutionally sensitive. The governance apparatus's assessment that it was is established by the severity of the disciplinary response. The analytical question is whether the institutional sensitivity of the disclosure is adequately evaluated as a governance matter, independently of the institutional inadequacy of the consequences the underlying conduct received. And the answer the basketball world is arriving at is that an institutional assessment that treats the disclosure as more bannable than the conduct itself produced is an institutional assessment whose priority ordering reveals more about what the governance apparatus is protecting than about what it is seeking to address through the disciplinary action. Now let us talk about the specific dynamics of the turmoil inside the player population, because this is the layer that has the most direct implications for the long-term institutional health of the WNBA's competitive and governance ecosystem, and the mainstream coverage is treating the player turmoil primarily as emotional reaction, rather than examining the specific institutional dynamics that the ban has created within the player community. The Cunningham ban has created a specific and visible divide within the player population between those who assess the ban as an institutional overreach that confirms the governance apparatus's commitment to image management over accountability, and those who assess the ban as the legitimate application of disclosure governance standards to a specific form of exposure that went beyond what competitive advocacy justifies. That divide is itself institutionally significant because it reflects the specific uncertainty within the player community about the scope and the limits of the governance authority the collective bargaining agreement grants the WNBA's disciplinary apparatus over the competitive advocacy conduct of its players. Players who have been considering forms of public advocacy similar to what Cunningham has been engaging in throughout this season are now evaluating the Cunningham ban against their own advocacy plans and making specific adjustments based on their individual assessments of where the bannable threshold the ban has established sits relative to whatever they were planning to say or do. That specific individual evaluation process across the player population is the institutional chilling effect we discussed in the previous video on this topic, and the turmoil inside the player community is the aggregated institutional expression of every player simultaneously processing where the Cunningham ban leaves them in relation to the governance authority they understood the disciplinary apparatus to have over their competitive advocacy conduct. The Players Association's response to the turmoil is the institutional action that most directly determines whether the ban produces the specific chilling effect the governance apparatus apparently intended, or whether it instead produces the collective advocacy escalation that institutional overreach against individual advocates typically generates when the advocate has as deep a relationship with the collective player community as Cunningham has established throughout this season. Now let us talk about the specific commercial turmoil the ban has produced in the broadcast and commercial partner community, because this is the layer that carries the most direct implications for the WNBA's institutional commercial health, and the mainstream coverage is treating the commercial turmoil as a secondary consequence of the governance controversy rather than as an independent and equally significant institutional story. The Clark-era commercial partners who have invested in women's basketball based on the specific commercial metrics the Clark era has produced are now evaluating the Cunningham ban against their own commercial interests in a very specific way. The ban is not simply a disciplinary decision that these partners can assess independently of their commercial relationships with the WNBA. It is a commercial event that tests the alignment between the governance apparatus's institutional priorities and the values and expectations of the fan base whose commercial engagement sustains the commercial value of every investment these partners have made in women's basketball during the Clark era. The specific commercial consequence of the Cunningham ban for the broadcast and commercial partner community is the commercial assessment that every partner is now making of whether the governance apparatus's institutional priority ordering, as confirmed by the ban, is compatible with the commercial proposition they have been building their women's basketball investments around. That commercial assessment is not necessarily producing decisions to exit commercial relationships, but it is producing the specific institutional unease that characterizes commercial relationships, in which a governance decision has revealed something about the institutional priorities of the league being invested in that was not adequately accounted for in the commercial investment calculus. The turmoil in the commercial partner community is the aggregated institutional expression of every partner simultaneously reassessing the governance dimension of the commercial proposition the WNBA represents, in light of what the Cunningham ban has formally confirmed about the governance apparatus's actual institutional priorities. Now let us zoom all the way out, because the turmoil the Cunningham ban has produced across every layer of women's basketball's institutional ecosystem is the most concentrated and the most comprehensive single institutional event in the Clark era, producing simultaneously the most significant player governance crisis, the most commercially damaging single disciplinary decision, and the most institutionally revealing confirmation of the governance apparatus's actual priority ordering that the entire arc of the season's accountability story has been building toward. Every previous element of the governance accountability story this season has produced institutional reactions that were significant, but that existed within specific institutional boundaries that the governance apparatus could manage through the standard combination of disciplinary response, communications management, and the institutional inertia that allows organizations to absorb accountability pressure without fundamentally changing the underlying institutional priorities that the pressure is directed at. The Cunningham ban is different in kind from every previous accountability crisis because it has produced institutional turmoil simultaneously across every stakeholder level of the sports ecosystem, at a time when every accumulated layer of previous governance accountability pressure has already been building the institutional conditions that make this specific turmoil impossible to manage through the standard organizational responses. The timing is not coincidental. The Cunningham ban is happening at the specific institutional moment when the accumulated governance accountability pressure of the Clark era's most dramatic season has created the conditions in which even a single disciplinary decision of the magnitude the ban represents can produce turmoil at every institutional level simultaneously, because the accumulated pressure has already destabilized the organizational equilibrium that would otherwise allow the governance apparatus to absorb even a significant individual governance controversy without producing institution-wide turmoil. Remember the institutional detail I mentioned at the start that every outlet is missing and that changes the entire governance story? Here it is. The specific institutional pathway the ban used is not the standard individual disciplinary pathway that the governance apparatus has used for every previous player conduct decision this season. It is an institutional pathway that requires involvement from a level of the governance apparatus that has not been directly involved in any previous individual player disciplinary decision this season, and that elevation reveals that the decision to ban Cunningham was not made through the normal disciplinary process, but through a specific institutional process that the gravity of the exposure's institutional sensitivity required to be addressed at a higher governance level than individual disciplinary decisions normally reach. That elevation is itself the most specific available indicator of what the governance apparatus was actually protecting through the ban, because the institutional level at which the decision had to be made to protect it establishes the institutional significance of whatever the exposure threatened to damage. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the institutional turmoil the ban has produced, and why it matters beyond the immediate controversy of the disciplinary decision. The specific institutional turmoil the ban has created is not simply the aggregated reaction of multiple stakeholder groups to a single governance decision. It is the specific institutional state that results when a governance apparatus makes a decision that simultaneously confirms the worst fears of its player population, alienates the fan base whose commercial engagement its business model requires, creates institutional unease in its commercial partner community, and reveals through the specific procedural elevation of the decision the actual institutional significance of what it was protecting through the ban. The combination of all four of those simultaneous institutional consequences in a single disciplinary decision is what makes the turmoil genuinely threatening to the WNBA's institutional health, rather than simply the kind of governance controversy that professional sports leagues regularly absorb and move past. Each of the four institutional consequences the ban has produced would be manageable independently. The combination of all four simultaneously, in the specific institutional context of the accumulated accountability pressure the Clark era's most dramatic season has created, is what makes the turmoil the most consequential single governance crisis the WNBA has faced in the Clark era. The second hidden angle that nobody is adequately discussing is the specific institutional opportunity the turmoil creates for the governance reform effort that the entire season's accountability story has been building toward. Turmoil at the scale and the institutional comprehensiveness the Cunningham ban has produced is the specific institutional condition that most directly creates the organizational incentive for fundamental governance reform, because it makes the cost of governance continuation without reform greater than the cost of the governance reform itself. And that institutional cost calculation is the mechanism through which accountability advocacy most effectively produces genuine governance change, rather than the incremental adjustments and communications management that governance apparatuses deploy to absorb accountability pressure without addressing its underlying causes. My verdict on the WNBA's institutional turmoil following the Cunningham ban is this, stated without any qualification or hedging: the WNBA is in turmoil following the Cunningham ban because the governance apparatus has made the most institutionally revealing and the most commercially damaging single disciplinary decision of the Clark era, formally confirming through the ban's specific institutional asymmetry that the priority ordering governing its disciplinary decisions places institutional image management above accountability for conduct in a way that is incompatible with the commercial and competitive promise the Clark era has made to the fan base, whose engagement sustains the sport's most significant commercial development. And the turmoil is the appropriate institutional reaction to encountering that confirmation at the specific institutional moment, when every accumulated layer of the season's accountability story has already been building the conditions that make the turmoil impossible to contain within the standard boundaries of a single governance controversy. The first reason this verdict is correct is the institutional asymmetry the ban confirms. The formal documentation of a consequence more severe for exposure than for conduct is an institutional record that defines the governance apparatus's actual priority ordering more specifically than any amount of official communications language can define it, and that definition is what the turmoil is most institutionally directed at. The second reason is the commercial consequence for the fan relationship. The Cunningham ban has produced the specific commercial turmoil in the fan relationship that the Clark-era commercial development was most institutionally vulnerable to, because it targets the specific figure whose relationship with the Clark-era fan base is most deeply grounded in the values and the advocacy that the fan base came to women's basketball to celebrate. The third reason is the governance reform opportunity the turmoil creates. The institutional conditions the turmoil has produced are the specific conditions most directly favorable to the fundamental governance reform that the entire season's accountability story has been demanding, and the turmoil is therefore not simply a governance crisis, but the institutional moment most directly favorable to the governance transformation the Clark era requires. The strongest counter-argument is that the turmoil the ban has produced reflects an overreaction to a specific disciplinary decision that the governance apparatus had both the authority and the institutional logic to make, and that the organizational framework of professional sports governance requires the enforcement of disclosure standards, regardless of the commercial and fan relationship consequences of specific enforcement decisions. That argument has genuine merit as a formal governance authority defense. The counter to the counter is that governance authority and governance wisdom are different institutional qualities, and that a governance apparatus that cannot exercise its formal authority in ways that account for the commercial and institutional consequences of specific enforcement decisions is a governance apparatus that is failing the institutional responsibility its commercial relationships create, regardless of whether the specific exercise of authority was formally within its governance mandate. So tell me in the comments right now, do you think the WNBA's turmoil following the Cunningham ban will produce the fundamental governance reform the Clark era has been demanding, or do you think the governance apparatus's institutional inertia is sufficient to absorb even the most comprehensive simultaneous institutional turmoil that the Clark era has produced? Drop your answer because this question is the most important governance accountability question in professional women's basketball right now. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction, the collective institutional response to the turmoil the Cunningham ban has produced, including the Players Association's formal challenge, the commercial partner community's institutional reassessment, and the fan base's commercial engagement response, creates sufficient combined institutional pressure within 30 days to produce formal governance commitments from the WNBA that directly address the specific institutional asymmetry the ban confirmed, including a formal commitment to specific and measurable standards for the consistency of disciplinary consequences between conduct and exposure of conduct that the collective bargaining agreement can formally incorporate. High confidence because the simultaneous turmoil across every institutional stakeholder level creates a combined accountability pressure that no previous single governance controversy in the Clark era has produced, and that combined pressure is the specific institutional condition most directly favorable to governance commitments of genuine substance, rather than the communications management responses that individual stakeholder turmoil typically produces. Second prediction, the specific institutional pathway the ban used, the elevation beyond the standard disciplinary process that the institutional detail reveals, becomes the central legal argument in the Players Association's formal challenge and produces a formal finding that the ban was procedurally deficient in ways that require either its overturn or its formal justification through the governance process that the elevation required, and that was apparently not fully followed in the specific form the collective bargaining agreement requires. Medium confidence because the specific procedural argument is legally strong enough to be the most promising basis for the formal challenge, but the specific legal and contractual analysis required to establish the procedural deficiency depends on the Players Association's legal representation accessing the specific governance process documentation that would establish the deficiency, which is not guaranteed to be available through the formal challenge process. Third prediction, and this is the bold one, the institutional turmoil the Cunningham ban has produced becomes the specific governance crisis that produces the first fundamental reform of the WNBA's disciplinary framework in the league's history, creating formal and binding institutional accountability mechanisms for the consistency of disciplinary consequences between conduct and exposure of conduct, the procedural standards for different levels of disciplinary severity, and the governance authority boundaries that distinguish individual disciplinary decisions from institutional-level governance actions that require collective bargaining consultation before implementation. Low confidence on the specific timeline because fundamental governance framework reforms require institutional processes that move at their own pace, but the specific institutional conditions the turmoil has created are more favorable to fundamental governance framework reform than any previous governance crisis in the Clark era has produced. Remember that procedural elevation detail? That specific institutional fact is both the most analytically significant detail in the entire story and the most legally actionable basis for the formal challenge the Players Association needs to mount, and the combination of analytical